This is very intimidating. It's a huge hall. I rarely spoken to such a big audience that I couldn't see at all. I'll talk today about happiness and memory and attention. And I'll start quickly because there is a lot that I want to tell you. I'm going to propose that when you ask yourself questions, or when I ask you a question, there are two different cells that can answer. If I ask you, or if the doctor asks you, does it hurt now? Then the self that answer is the one that I will call the experiencing self. But when the doctor asks, did you sleep well, or how painful was it yesterday, a different self speaks. He's not speaking about the moment, he is speaking about the past. And I will call that self the remembering self. So the experiencing self goes through life moment by moment. Actually, we can almost count the number of moments. Psychologists have some idea of how long a moment lasts. You can define it in different ways, but you can think of a moment as lasting 3 seconds. And if it lasts 3 seconds, then there are 20 every minute, and you can calculate how many there are in a month, in a year, and in a lifetime. And there are many. And what happens to those moments, those very brief moments of experience, is basically they're gone forever. Most of the moments of our life leave essentially no trace in memory, or no important trace in memory. What we are left with is what the remembering self is left with. We're left with stories, and the remembering self tells stories. Basically, memory tells stories. As soon as an event is completed, we have a story about it. And the story typically includes a beginning and a middle and an end, and it has causes, and it has intentions, it has goals. Some of the goals are met, and other goals end in failure. But life, as it is seen by the remembering self, is a succession of stories. Now, what is interesting, I think, and important is that the only thing that we're left with is we're left with the stories. The experience is gone. And that can create complexities. I think basically we're all completely confused between memory and experience. And I'm going to give you an example that struck me the most. And this is something that somebody said when I had finished a lecture. Somebody got up and told us an experience that he had had. He said, the other day, I was listening to a symphony, and I listened to the symphony, and it was absolutely glorious music. And then toward the end, just before the end of the symphony, there was a dreadful sound on the record, a screeching sound. And the man added, with some emotion, that ruined the whole experience. And if you stop to think about it, it didn't ruin the whole experience, because he had had the experience. He had listened to 20 minutes of glorious music. What it ruined is the memory of the experience. So the end ruined the memory. And to the individual, because the memory is all that is left, all that he got to keep, he didn't get to keep much of anything, except it ruined the whole experience. It was a bad experience. Now, if you can look at life in two very different ways. In one of the ways, what matters is the 20 minutes of experience. And in the other way, which is the way a remembering self has it, the only thing that matters is what you're left with, is the stories that you're left with. I draw 3 morals from the symphony story. The first one is that you should not always believe your remembering self, because a lot of the time it just doesn't know what it's thinking. And it does not have a good idea of the events of the past. What it has is a story about the past. The story is not necessarily accurate. The second point that I would like to draw from this is that what is left from the experience, the quality of the story, and this is true of all the stories, is determined not completely, but to a very large extent by what happens at the end. In this case, the end was bad, so the entire thing was bad. This is the way our memory works. Ends are very important, and if things end well, then they were good. If things end badly, then they were bad. And the third point is there is an absolutely critical difference between the life of the experiencing self and the life of the remembering self, and it has to do with the way that they treat time. In stories, time just doesn't matter very much. But for the experiencing self, time is absolutely essential. When I was thinking about these problems, I went to the opera to see La Traviata. And La Traviata is wonderful. Many of you have seen it. And in the end, there is Violetta, and she has tuberculosis, and she's about to die. And her lover, and it's a complicated story, but she was estranged from the lover, and he's coming to see her. And we all know that she's about to die, and that he's coming to see her. And it is very, very important to all of us, as the audience watching this opera, we want him to get there, because it seems very important. And he does get there. And she sings for 10 minutes, and then she dies. And that's the end of the story. Now, it turns out it is a good story. It is a good story because it ends well. What we don't care at all about is time. It was enough that he came, and she sang for 10 minutes, and that defined the end of the story. You know, if he had got caught in traffic in a taxi and hadn't come in time, it would have been a different opera. It would have been a different story. In contrast, if you think about measuring the quality of experiences for the experiencing self, here is a question that I remember I was asking myself and I was asking my colleague Emma Tversky almost 40 years ago. I asked about somebody who is getting a series of painful injections. Every day, one injection. And every day it hurts the same way the day before. And I asked, how should we compare somebody who gets 20 injections to somebody who gets only 5 if every day it hurts the same? And it turns out the logic is inescapable. 20 injections is exactly 4 times as bad as 5 injections. And if you're at having a vacation, and it's not a terribly interesting vacation, you're on the beach, and it's very nice, and you spend there 1 week, and then you spend another week, and it is still very nice, just as nice as the first week, then I would say for the experiencing self, 2 weeks is just as good, is twice as good as 1 week. Time is absolutely essential when we try to think of the quality of life for someone. And then, when you think about this, time is the ultimate limited resource. There is a finite amount of time. And for the experiencing self, we want to know what happened in that time. For the remembering self wants to know what is the story. And you can see, by the way, that the interests of the remembering self and the experiencing self, when it comes to vacations, they do not have the same interests. The remembering self is not interested in a second week on the beach because nothing more is going to happen. All the memories were formed in the first week, and it's just going to be more of the same. For the experiencing self, the second week is just as good as the first. And I have a thought exercise for you. Suppose you knew when you go to your next vacation that at the end of the vacation, your camera will be thrown away, or you can keep your camera, but all your film will be destroyed. And you will get a drug which is an amnesic drug so that you won't remember anything of the vacation. Now, would you still go on vacation? Your experiencing self will have a completely normal experience. And would you go to the same vacation if you knew you were going to remember it, or if you knew you were going to forget it? And I bring that example to illustrate the fact that there is a conflict between the two selves. What is good for the experiencing self and what is good for the remembering self are not necessarily the same thing. I have a small disaster. My PowerPoint, my notes. Okay. Let me go back to the scoring of experience, to the scoring by the remembering self. The importance of ending is reflected very nicely by things that we say. We say to people, don't do it. You will regret it. And that is supposed to convince you not to do it. Or we tell people it will end badly. And that is supposed to tell you not to do it. It shouldn't mean that, actually. It really depends. It depends how much you will regret it, and it will depend how much you will enjoy it. And maybe, although you will regret it, it's worth doing. Because the end for the experiencing self is not more important than any other moment. And so the calculations are quite different. Now, I don't mean by this that the experiencing self leads you to hedonism or to thinking only about the present. Actually, it's almost the contrary. Because the experiencing self, what counts for the experiencing self, is time. And so if you think, for example, of becoming addicted, of somebody who becomes addicted to cigarettes or to heroin, the question really, from the perspective of the experiencing self, is how long and how much will you enjoy it, and how long and how much will you suffer later. So it is not that somebody who thinks about the experiencing self will say that the future doesn't matter. For the experiencing self, the future matters. The far future may matter just as much as the near future. Which, by the way, is not true in economic reasoning about those things. Now, it turns out that how you would want to lead your life depends to some extent, depends to a large extent, on whether you're thinking of the remembering self, of the satisfaction or happiness of the remembering self, or whether you're thinking of the experiencing self. We know from research we have done in recent years, we have looked at that separately. So we have asked people questions about how satisfied they are with their life, and we have asked them questions about their emotional experience minute by minute or in the course of the day. And it turns out that the answers are quite different. Having the best life for the remembering self is a pretty conventional thing. The people who tell us they're satisfied with their life have more education, have higher income, and in general achieve their goals. So those are people who have a good story. It's a good conventional life story. In some cases it's not conventional, but mostly, for most people, it is conventional. Now, to think about what it would mean to maximize the experience of the experiencing self, to maximize the quality of the experienced life, let me first point out that we think very poorly about this. This is a topic about which people's intuitions are really miserably poor. And the reason is something that I have called the focusing illusion. To tell you a bit about what the focusing illusion is, we ran a study some years ago to find out whether people in California are happier than people elsewhere in the United States, specifically in Ohio. There is a big difference in the weather. The weather in California is very good, at least in Los Angeles. The weather in Ohio is really not very good, neither in winter nor in summer. And people everywhere think that people in California are happier. People in California are sure of it, but people in Ohio are also sure of it. It turns out it isn't particularly true. There isn't much of a difference at all between California and Ohio in terms of happiness. But it's interesting to ask, why do people think that they will be in a better mood in California? And the reason is that when they think of California, they think of the contrast between California and Ohio. The contrast is climate. The climate is better in California. They focus on the climate and they decide, I will be happier in California. But in fact, what happens is that people in their routine life spend very little time thinking about the climate or experiencing the climate. And the climate is not very important in people's lives, neither the experiencing self nor for the remembering self. In order to understand this, we must understand attention. And let me give you an example. And the example is from a study by Norbert Schwartz and a student. And his question was, he asked people, how much pleasure do you get from your car? The question, the kind of question that psychologists ask. And people can answer this. And there is a correlation between the quality of the car, or the dollar value of the car, and how much pleasure people think they get from it. But if you actually measure the pleasure, the mood of people when they're driving their car to work, the correlation with the quality of the car is effectively zero. Because when do people get pleasure from the car? They get pleasure when they think about the car. And people don't think much about the car except when the car is completely new or when they're showing it off to somebody else. Most of the time, when we drive the car, we're thinking of something else. And the car contributes very little to our happiness. This is true for most experiences and for most goods. And that is the reason for the focusing illusion. When you first move to California, especially if you move in winter, and the climate is wonderful, you really experience the joy of it. It just doesn't last very long. But people, when they think about a change, they think that this is going to stay, this is the way the experience is going to be in future. So in order to understand the happiness of the experiencing self, we have to understand attention. What is it that people pay attention to? What are the experiences which are like a big car or the climate in California tend to adapt so that people pay less and less attention to them? And what are the experiences for which this isn't true? Let me begin with some bad experiences that people do not adapt to. People do not adapt to chronic pain, not at all. People do not adapt to depression. People actually do not adapt to loud noise. Anything that calls attention to itself, people do not adapt to. There are also some good experiences that people do not adapt to. They do not adapt to the pleasure of breakfast. There are other pleasures they do not adapt to. They do not adapt to socializing with friends. They do not adapt to their hobbies. And they do not adapt to the pleasure of work when work feels like a hobby. So when you're thinking about how to invest your limited resource of money and of time, the advice from this consideration is you should try to invest in good experiences to which you will not adapt. And that typically means spending a lot of time with people you like. It turns out that when you look at the happiness of the experiencing self, this is one of the major determinants. That and engage in activities that they enjoy. The point that I'm trying to make here is that we have those two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. They have different interests. They have different ways of looking at the world. And when you think about happiness or well-being, you get to different answers depending on whether you're interested in people having a good story or in having a good life. And it is not necessarily the same that having a good story and having a good life are the same, are identical. So this is what I had to tell you, and I finished with 1 minute to spare. Thank you.
Bravo.